Greetings and welcome to Live at 3:45. I'm Conrad Knegge and delighted to have with us today as our guest, Richard Kauffman. Richard is a longtime pastor, editor, writer, and has, as I've described him, has a broad view of the church, a deep view of the church, has been observing the church a long time, writing about the church a long time, and has seen the church from a variety of different angles and perspectives that I think are unique to many of us, and that he brings that perspective. And so welcome, Richard. We're delighted to have you with us, and just going to open it up to you to share with us what you see, what you've seen, and then we'll open it up again at the end for questions that anyone might have. But go ahead and introduce yourself to us, Richard, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Well, I have roots in Lancaster County. Grew up Mennonite, and frankly have always been Mennonite. I now live in Goshen, Indiana. I'm officially retired, although right now I'm in my second interim pastorate. I've done 2 interim pastorates since I retired. In this case, it's part of a pastoral team. I'm half-time on a pastoral team of 3 people. Yeah, I've been an editor most of my adult life, but I've also been a pastor. And I was at what was then Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary, now is Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, where I was both an administrator and an instructor in theology. And from there, I went to Christianity Today magazine in the western suburbs of Chicago, and then did a brief pastorate, and then got back into editing at the Christian Century magazine in downtown Chicago. And I guess I kind of take it for granted, but I know every once in a while people call it to my attention that I've had kind of unusual involvements vocationally, both in the evangelical world, CT, and in the mainline Protestant world, the Christian Century, and then in the Mennonite world as well, where I worked for probably 25 years of my adult life. You know, Søren Kierkegaard has this great quote about life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And that's so absolutely true. So when I look back on my life, I see how the pieces fit together, but I could have never planned that. And I realize in retrospect that really I think it was providential. It was God's hand involved in every twist and turn in my life. So Conrad's kind of given me freedom just to talk. And I forewarned him that I'll probably get into a storytelling mode, because that's kind of what I do best, I think. So I just want to talk a little bit about my experiences at Christianity Today and the Christian Century, and draw some conclusions from that, and then make some, hopefully, concluding remarks about where I see the church at today. So as I said, I was at the Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart, and in 1994, the then president, Marlon Miller, had a sudden and unexpected heart attack and died. And my tenure was tied to his tenure, and suddenly I was going to be without a job. So I started looking around, and lo and behold, the one thing that opened up for me was Christianity Today. Now, there's a little story behind that. So the executive editor at that point at CT was a man by the name of David Neff. He came from the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, had gone to seminary at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, which is not that far from Goshen. And in those days, there was cross-registration between Andrews Divinity School, the theology department at Notre Dame, and AMBS. And so some students would come down from St. Andrews to take courses at AMBS. And of course, in those days, the big star was John Howard Yoder. For reasons I won't go into, he's since become a fallen star. So David Neff is one of those SDA students who came to AMBS, and he told me, he said, you know, it wasn't the pacifism that rubbed off on me, it was the discipleship that rubbed off on me. And he didn't get that so much from Yoder, he got that from the other Mennonite students in the class. And he said, you know, growing up in the Seventh-day Adventist church, there was no emphasis on discipleship at all. And discipleship really became a major theme in his life. So he started out kind of at the bottom of the ladder, you would say, at Christianity Today, and worked his way up to the executive editor. And because I was from AMBS and because I was Mennonite, he took an interest in me. I don't think I would have gotten that job otherwise. So I went there, and I was there 5 years. Had some really interesting experiences. One of the things I realized rather early on was, on the one hand, CT in those days tried to claim a big tent evangelicalism. They wanted everybody that considered themselves evangelicals to be a part of CT. And yet, when push came to shove, what came to the surface was a reformed form of evangelicalism. And the second thing I discovered was there were a lot of evangelicals who did not feel very well represented by CT. They didn't fit that reform mold. You know, whether they were Wesleyan or Holiness or Pentecostal or Charismatic or Anabaptist or Churches of Christ, whatever, they felt kind of disaffected from it. So unofficially, I kind of decided, well, I'm going to try to represent these underrepresented groups at CT. So I'm going to tell you one story, which I think is kind of illuminating. It kind of tells a bigger story in a way. So I was the sponsor for an article written by an American church history professor by the name of Timothy Weber. He did a fantastic article with the title, "Why American Evangelicals Became Israel's Best Friends." And he's a terrific writer. I mean, it's just fantastically. And I just thought this has to be published. And the publisher was a man by the name of Harold Meyer at that point. I grew to respect Harold, but he and I had many conversations and had to work things out. So when I was at CT, there were, I think, 13 different magazines, but CT, the magazine, was kind of the flagship magazine. And so he took great interest and read everything that went out through CT and improved everything. So he was not going to approve this article. So we had to have at least 3 different conversations. And the reason he was reluctant to publish his article, because essentially the article was a history of dispensationalism, history and a critique, you might say, but also then kind of advancing the idea that something that started with dispensationalism bled over into mainstream evangelicalism, which led to this great support for the nation of Israel. And Meyer's concern was that the dispensationalists in this big tent would be very upset with CT for publishing it. Finally, a thought came to me. He was sitting in my office. Well, I have to back up a little bit. So when you become hired, at least in those days, by CT, you would get this packet of materials, orientation materials. And one of them in particular was pointed out to me. And here it was a document that Billy Graham had put together in 1956 when he called a conference in Cincinnati to propose a magazine that eventually became Christianity Today. Well, this document is so interesting to me because the whole thing was patterned after what was then the Christian Century, but it was a conservative evangelical alternative to the Christian Century. That was Billy Graham's point, that the evangelical movement needed an alternative to this liberal Christian Century publication. Well, so Meyer was sitting in my office and we were talking about this article on American evangelical support for Israel. Suddenly it dawned on me. I said, Harold, do you remember what Billy Graham said in that proposal for CT about eschatology? And he said, no. I said, well, he speaks to eschatology. And he said, CT, the magazine that he was proposing, would be premillennial in eschatology, but it would not be dispensational. Harold thought a minute. He said, could you get me a copy of that? Oh my goodness. I almost fell off my chair because I had gotten my copy from his executive secretary. So I pulled it out, I made a copy of it, took him to his office. He said, let's go with the article. Oh, that was just one. I could tell you really many stories like that. You know, one of the things that was disturbing me then already, and I was there from 95 to 2000, was the emerging role of the religious right, moral majority, and so forth, Christian Coalition. And I really thought that CT, being the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, should be more critical of the religious right. But again, there was this concern, this fear about not wanting to alienate that segment of the evangelical community. So they would do these big profiles, cover stories of evangelical leaders, including leaders in the religious right. I mean, I remember there was one on Pat Robertson, for example, another on Francis Schaeffer. And I don't mean to suggest that they were lacking in criticism, but to me, they didn't seem to be critical enough, particularly of their association with really right-wing politics. So, what are we doing time-wise here? You're gonna have to call me on time, I think. Kind of. So jump to 2016. You have 81% of white evangelicals voting for a man who, it had just come out, bragged about being able to grab women by their private parts and get away with it. How could that be? How could that be? I would say if you're interested in an answer to that question, I would strongly recommend to you a relatively recent book. It came out last year by Kristen Kobes-Dumais, entitled "Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation." She herself came out of that community. She's Christian Reformed in background. In fact, teaches at Calvin College, which is CRC, Christian Reformed Church. And it's a fantastic book. It's a fantastic read. And in a way, it's really a history of the last 75 years of American evangelicalism, but in particular, a critique of white American evangelicalism, alignment with right-wing politics. It's pretty devastating, actually. Well, I could tell you more stories, but I see our time is moving on.
No, you're doing all right. We've got 10 minutes yet.
So I did want to talk about my work at Christian Century a little bit. One day, Harold Meyer came down the hallway at CT. His office, executive office, was totally on the other side of the building. He often was down there. And he had in his hand the latest issue of the Christian Century. And he made the observation that almost everything that was in that issue of the Christian Century could be published in Christianity Today. It kind of blew me away. But I had to agree with him. Now, the reverse was not true. It wouldn't have been true that everything in the most recent issue of the Christianity Today could be published in Christian Century. But my point of mentioning that was this was actually an era when Christianity Today on the right and the Christian Century on the left were both moderating toward the center. And I give David Neff credit for that at CT. I give my eventual boss at the Christian Century credit for that, for the Christian Century. His name was David also, David Hein. His father had been an American Baptist pastor in Vermont. He himself belonged to a Lutheran church, which was actually a breakaway congregation from the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church when they had that big fight over inerrancy back in the 70s. And he had studied at Yale Divinity School and had been influenced by the old Yale School of Theology, which sometimes is characterized as being post-liberal. And so when David Neff called me, and I was pastoring at this point, pastoring at Toledo Mennonite Church in Ohio, called me out of the blue, asked me if I ever wanted to go back into editing. I said, well, no, not really. I said, I'm pastoring now, it's going well, and this is what I feel called to do. And then I started thinking about this, and 2 weeks later I thought, you know, I always thought working for the Christian Center would be kind of like the ideal job. So I called him back and asked if the position was still open. He said, yeah, he wanted to talk about it. And I said, yeah. So the rest is history. I had an interview and eventually got offered a job there. So one of the things that David Heim said to me when I went to Christian Center, he said, I want to re-anchor the Christian century theologically. He felt that Christian century under his predecessor had become kind of unmoored. And he said it was just kind of the Christian version of the New Republic. And so re-anchoring the magazine theologically for him meant taking seriously the so-called classical tradition of Christian faith, which took seriously the creedal tradition of the Christian faith. And it also took very seriously the current lived life of Christian congregations. And that seemed to me to be a project that I could be a part of. So soon after I got to Christian Century, I thought I need to kind of lay down a mark here, okay? So I said, you know, I think I can probably agree with almost anything that you want to publish in this magazine, except I'd have a hard time accepting anything written by the Jesus Seminar or by Bishop Spong. Now, I don't know if those names ring a bell to you or not, but the Jesus Seminar was this effort by some really kind of radical New Testament scholars back in the 80s and 90s to go through the Gospels and using their criteria, some of which seemed to me to be rather forced, to decide which of Jesus' sayings were authentic and which weren't authentic. And of course, they came up with a pretty thin Jesus at the end. And then, of course, Bishop Spong, he was this retired Episcopalian bishop who I think had really kind of kicked the traces, as it were, and well, yeah, I guess the word heresy might be appropriate in this case. So, believe it or not, my colleagues in the Christian Century said, you know, we don't have any problem with that. They said, well, what if we would actually publish stuff by Marcus Borg? Marcus Borg was one of the members of the Jesus Seminar. Well, I had read some of Marcus Borg to good effect and found him to be a deeply spiritual person. I said, yeah, I could accept Marcus Borg. I did have some issues with the Christian Century. I wasn't there very long before the Iraq War broke out. And of course, as a Mennonite pacifist, I was opposed to that. I soon discovered that all of my editorial colleagues also were opposed to it, except for David Heim. And of course, he was the one who called the shots. But he is and was kind of a Niebuhrian. And he thought that Saddam Hussein posed a real threat, a threat to world peace and to American security, and something needed to be done about that. So the Christian Century never editorialized against the Iraq War. Nevertheless, it did carry some articles that were anti-war. So I talked to friends about that, and they assumed the Christian Century was against it because we had these articles that were anti-war. And I said, yeah, but have you ever noticed anything on the editorial pages? No, I hadn't seen anything. Well, I said, there you go. And of course, Heim eventually saw the error of his ways. The other issue around which he and I had some differences had to do with the Middle East. Now, ironically, David Neff, who was the editor, remember, at CT, he was a member of EMEU, Evangelicals for Middle Eastern Understanding. In fact, he was president of that organization. And it was one group of evangelicals, contrasting to the mainstream, who loved Israel, who were very sympathetic toward and supportive of Palestinians, especially Palestinian Christians. So he had that sensitivity. Now, at Christian Century, David Heim's predecessor was a man named James Wall. And I'd love to tell you a story that has a Mennonite angle to it, but there isn't time. And he was very pro-Palestinian, and he just kept hammering at it over and over again, editorialized it on it very often. And then after he retired, he was given a column, and he kept writing on that theme over and over again, and really became kind of a broken record. I really felt like, well, we've heard this before from you, Jim. Well, David Heim's perspective was we want to kind of recalibrate this Middle Eastern thing and move more toward the center and not just lean so incredibly in one direction. The problem that I saw as this developed was that recalibrating toward the center actually meant kind of leaning in the other direction and becoming pro-Israel. And David Heim had a very strong Zionist rabbi friend from Chicago who leaned on him an awful lot and even took him on trips to the Middle East that I thought was just a bad influence. So Heim and I had my differences around that issue. Again, most of the other editors on the Christian Century staff at that point were more sympathetic with the Palestinian cause than David was. But I respected David, and David, I would say, became a friend of mine, and I would say he was probably the best boss I've ever had. So despite our differences, I have a great deal of respect for him, and actually miss my relationship with him. So one of the great things, maybe I'll just end with this, and then we can throw it open for questions. But one of the great experiences for me at the Christian Century magazine was getting to know mainline Protestant pastors. And I just found so many conservative Christian bias, and maybe bias on the part of a lot of Mennonites. I just found a lot of mainline Protestant pastors who are incredibly committed to the Christian gospel and to the church and the church's mission in the world. Some of these people were actually ex-evangelicals. And, I kind of jokingly said sometimes, well, the best mainline Protestant pastors are ex-evangelicals, particularly if they didn't feel like they needed to react to their evangelical past, but they brought the best out of the evangelical past and then embraced maybe a broader vision of what it means to be a Christian, a broader vision, allowing for women pastors, for example. I mean, that was a fulcrum for many people who moved from an evangelical world to a mainline Protestant world, but also the issue of sexuality was another turning point for so many of these people. I guess the concern that I have for mainline Protestant Christians, but it's also a concern that I have for many of my own Mennonite brothers and sisters, is an increasing secularization of the faith, and kind of a loss of the language, what I call the loss of the language of faith. The primary languages of faith are prayer and testimony. Prayer is what we address to God. Testimony is what we say about God to other people. Those I say are the primary languages, and I just find so many lay people, in particular in the mainline Protestant world, but also in the Mennonite world, to be what my friend Sarah Wenger Shank has called in her most recent book that just came out, tongue-tied. Tongue-tied. So if you want to read more about this topic, I highly advise Sarah's book. See if I can find the subtitle to her book here somewhere. Well, I'm not finding it right now.
Well, I've been thinking about having her as a guest, so that'll motivate me
Well,
to do that.
Conrad, I was going to recommend
Yeah.
that book. I must say, came out of conversations that she and I and my pastor at College Mennonite Church had.
Mm.
Oh, wait. And then when there was a Believers Church conference at Goshen College in 2017, we put in a proposal for doing a seminar on that subject, and three of us approached it from slightly different directions. Sarah got a book offer out of a little piece that she wrote in an AMBS publication. So she ran with it, and more power to her. She did me the grace of quoting me a number of times in the book. So let me close it off there and see what this elicits from you folks.
Well, this is exactly why I wanted you to be on. I mean, you've exceeded even my expectations. Your personal experience across the breadth of the church. Thank you for sharing those stories. Let's open it up to the audience. Do you have questions or observations you'd like to make to Richard as we move towards closure?
Thank you for your storytelling. You have brought both ends of the spectrum from your experience, and you've really informed us well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I remember you, Ken. You're an Ontario pastor, right?
I'm now in Saskatchewan.
Oh, you're in Saskatchewan. Okay. Well, I can see that you have a backdrop similar to mine.
Richard, where do you see the church these days? And I know that's a broad question, but you've seen it broadly. Where are we at in the God's landscape?
Well, Conrad, you've done more work in this than I have.
Well, I'm only one voice.
You know, I am concerned about the church in North America. I mean, just looking at things statistically, church membership, church attendance are both down. I think for the first time, the number of people who claim some kind of faith affiliation is under 50%. The number of nuns, that is people who have no religious affiliation whatsoever, that number is going up, particularly among the millennials. So yeah, I am concerned about the future. But one thing I keep thinking about, you know the law of entropy. Everything tends to wind down and peter out and die eventually. I think there are two dynamics in human experience that are not subject to the law of entropy. The one is love, and the other is spirit. And those two realities are regenerative. So if there's any hope for the future of the church, I think it's going to be some new emphasis on the love of God and the power of the Holy Spirit indwelling and empowering the church. Now, the other thing I would say in answer to your question, Conrad, if the church is going to be renewed, I think it's going to be a bottom-up renewal. And by that, I don't just mean lay people. It could be that. I mean, I've long felt that there have been very few experiences of church renewal that haven't in some way elicited and empowered the gifts of lay people. But bottom up, I mean from the Southern Hemisphere, from the global South. And I had experience of this in 2006 as an editor at the Christian Century. I was invited to go and report on the World Council of Churches when it met in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And again, you know, conservative, evangelical, Mennonites have this kind of jaundiced view of the World Council of Churches that's just so far out there. But when you see those churches coming together, you experience a different reality, and the vibrancy of particularly the Latin Christians, many of whom you would have to say, well, they may not call themselves charismatics, but they certainly have a charismatic form of worship. And then I just think also, I don't know, I know some of you are Mennonites. I don't want to assume you all are Mennonites, but just think about Mennonite World Conference. Where's the vibrancy? Where's the spirit at work? I see that in my old employer. I was just over there yesterday, AMBS in Elkhart. Increasingly, they're having a hard time getting white Americans and Canadians to think about ministry and so forth and become seminary trained. So more and more of the students that they are getting are international students. I mean, they're developing a program now with the Ethiopian church. Of course, Sarah Wenger Schenk, her parents were missionaries in Ethiopia, so she has a personal tie to Ethiopia, and she helped start that. But it's not just Ethiopia, so they're getting more and more international students, and they live in the lump.
Richard, thank you. I feel encouraged. I've been quoting a lot Max Weber, early sociologist, who said that we're going to end up in modernity, trapping ourselves in an iron cage of rationality.
Steel cage, yep.
And he said the only way out is to recover old ideals, and there's no greater ideal than the ideal of love as presented in the Gospels, and for charismatic leaders to break through the bars that entrap us. And so this idea of charisma and the spirit and of love, I think are, I really appreciate the way you shared that. And testimony and prayer. I mean, it does come down to, I think, the simplicity of the way we walk with Jesus, of our developing our life with God. Thank you so much for what you shared with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for your grace in listening to me.
This episode will be available on my podcast, The Church Dismantled, The Kingdom Restored. It will also be available on my YouTube channel and on Facebook. So thank you all for being here. And Richard, thank you. This was a gem. Really appreciate it. Blessings to you.